Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Again. Welcome. Welcome to the first Humanities Forum event of the semester. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm a member of the philosophy department here and the director of the forum. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Humanities Forum series. One of the things we try to do with these events, which happen regularly on most Friday afternoons, is to integrate some of our events with the DWC cycle. I suspect that many of you happen to be freshmen thinking about Homer in your DWC classes right now, and it's a pleasure to have you here today for a very distinguished guest. I encourage you all to come back for future Fridays this semester. We have a wide variety of events planned, and in particular, we have a three-event series dedicated to the legacy and thought of Abraham Lincoln. It'd be great to see you back. Each of these events is complemented at the end with a reception. Usually it takes place in the great room. It'd be great to see you spend some time with one another, with faculty, with our guests. We always have a little bit of food. Please come join us afterwards if you can. That being said, please join me in welcoming Professor Alex Moffatt, a member of the English department and the director of the DWC program, to introduce this afternoon's guest.
Thank you, Raymond. Welcome students, faculty, staff, and members of the PC community. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Emily Wilson. Dr. Wilson comes to us from the University of Pennsylvania, where she is professor of classical studies. Her scholarly monographs on classical literature include The Greatest Empire, A Life of Seneca, published by Penguin in 2015, and The Death of Socrates, Hero, Villain, Chatterbox, Saint, published by Harvard University Press in 2007. She is also the author of many journal articles and other essays. Her translation work includes new editions of the works of Seneca, of Euripides, and, most recently, her 2017 translation of the Odyssey. To call this translation widely acclaimed would be the greatest of understatements. It has been described as, quote, a revelation by the New York Times Book Review, powerful and astonishing by the Atlantic Monthly, and a cultural landmark by The Guardian. I could go on for hours reading such commendations and exhaust the English language's hoard of positive adjectives in the process. So let me merely relate an anecdote. Knowing that Dr. Wilson was arriving in the fall, I read her translation this summer, and what started as an academic obligation quickly turned into a compulsive delight, as night after night I defied sleep to just get a little bit further into the poem. I've got to get to Calypso's Isle. I've got to get to Cyclops. I've got to get to Circe. Suddenly it's 2 a.m., and no amount of lotus eating could have slowed my progress. When you read it, you will fall in love with a poem all over again, and if you're reading it for the first time, you are in for the greatest of treats. Her talk today is titled On Translating Homer. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Emily Wilson.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for being here, and I'm sorry for the people who are uncomfortable. There is still floor space. If you'd like to come and sit down, you're very, very welcome to do that. So I thought I should start. I know that not everybody has read either the Odyssey or my translation of the Odyssey yet, though many of you will in a week or two. So I thought I should start by reading so you can have an idea about what my translation is like and also what the Odyssey is like. I'm going to start by reading a passage from book 13 out of 24, which might sound like a totally random number. But in a way, it's actually a very important number. The poem is divided into two halves. Odysseus' geographical journey home is done by halfway through the poem. So I'm going to read the moment when he gets home geographically. And I think the poem is asking you to ask some difficult questions about how does geographical homecoming relate to all the other things that homecoming must mean. It involves rebuilding relationships, and as well as slaughtering the people that you don't want in your home. How do you define your home? It includes who you keep out, who you kill, as well as who you welcome and reveal yourself to. So this is how he gets back to Ithaca, not in the end through his own labors, but through a magical self-steering boat given to him by his generous hosts in the land of Scheria, the Phaeacians, which whooshes through the water at miraculous speed. A sound, sweet sleep fell on his eyes, like death. He did not stir. As 4 fine stallions rushed at the whip and raced their chariot across the track, heads high, an easy canter, So was the ship's prow raised. The seething waves of sounding purple sea rushed round the stern as she sped straight ahead. The swiftest bird, a hawk, could never overtake. She sailed so fast and she cleaved the waves. She bore a man whose mind was like the gods, who had endured many heartbreaking losses and the pain of war and shipwreck. Now he slept in peace, and he remembered nothing of his pain. So as I hope you could hear, my translation is all in regular iambic pentameter, and I use a lot of alliteration, echoing the fact that the original also has a lot of alliteration. I did a great deal of reading out loud while I was working on it, both of the original and of my drafts in progress. I wanted to honor the clarity of Homer. The original poem is composed in a syntax that's really very easy. It's designed to be comprehensible by illiterate audiences experiencing it performed out loud. It's not designed as the kind of poem where you need footnotes to understand it. It has a quick narrative pace. It has precise, vivid details describing the material world, even when what's actually happening is bizarre, magical, godlike, mythical, totally unrealistic. Of course, even in archaic Greece, people didn't have magical self-steering ships, but in the moment, you should believe in it. I also hope that the passage would illustrate something about what the task of the translator is in moving from Homeric Greek to contemporary English. I have to carry my readers across unfathomable distances of space and time. And sometimes I want to do that with so much smooth, ostensibly effortless energy that the reader, like the sleeping Odysseus, barely notices how hard I've been working to make that happen. But I also want the reader to be sometimes aware of the speed or the time travel whiplash, sometimes to wake up, like Odysseus waking up on the island of Ithaca. It's his home, but Athena covers it with mist. He doesn't know where he is. He thinks this is the strangest island of all. So I want the reader sometimes to have those moments of, I don't know where I am. Is it 3,000 years ago, or is it now? What's the difference between then and now? I was first asked to consider translating the Odyssey by a lovely editor at Norton called Pete Simon, with whom I'd worked on the Norton anthologies of Western literature and world literature. I was excited to contemplate doing this because I've always loved the poem. Ever since, this is me when I was 8. I'd played the goddess Athena in the elementary school play, and they always did nativity plays, but one year the innovative teachers decided that this year they would do the Odyssey, so I got to be Athena, and that was the headmaster, and we got to poke out his papier-mâché eye with a stick. It was really fun. So I've always loved the poem ever since then. That was the first moment that I got access to the idea that ancient Greece was kind of cool and exciting, and it had kick-ass goddesses, and that was great. So I read lots of kids' adaptations of Greek myths at that stage. And then once I got older, I started learning both Latin and ancient Greek in high school and in college and so on. So I've been reading Homer in Greek for something like 3 decades. It's a beautifully rich narrative about questions I think about all the time, both in scholarly intellectual life and in daily personal life. I think it's a poem which raises the question of, am I the same person as this? Is Odysseus the same person when he gets back to Ithaca as the person he was 20 years ago? As you change through time, can you ever get back to who you used to be? Is there continuity? Is there difference? How do we respond to being in a new place with new people? How to deal with people who aren't like us, which is maybe everybody? About what it means to be at home, what a home even is. About hiding, rage, growing up, grief, imagination, recognition. I love, as I was saying at the start, how this poem turns the details of everyday life, like boats and moving through space and trees and tables, into these richly resonant symbols that define our relationships. But obviously loving the poem and being keen to keep on rereading it in the original is a totally different thing from thinking it's worthwhile to add to the huge pile of already existing translations in the English language. I knew there were already, when I started, more than 60 translations into English. This is just giving you an idea of how the pace is picking up. So in the first 200 years of translations of the Odyssey into English, there were less than 10. Then in the next 200 years, there's huge numbers, and then there's even more. There have been at least 2 since I published mine, maybe 3. See, it's a lot of different translations of the same poem. I could have just gone on reading the Odyssey in Greek on my own quietly without bothering anyone. It seemed to me that in order to think it's worthwhile to add to that huge pile, I had to have a sense of my translation would have to be in some way both truthful to the original and differently truthful from what's already out there. I had to be able to recreate the Odyssey in some somewhat different way. So I did the exercise of reading very slowly something like 10 or 12 existing translations of a particular passage, rereading the Greek, and thinking about what do I think I could do differently. And then also thinking about my experiences in the classroom, using different translations, and thinking about what was I not able to get across that I knew from the Greek that the students were having trouble with, that I might be able to convey differently. After doing that exercise, I realized there were elements of the original that I thought were missing or under-prioritized in existing translations. And so after doing that, I then put away the other translations and didn't look at them again for another 5 years. It took me 5 years to do my translation. And then since publishing it, I've started to look again at others, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So one of the big things that motivated me to say yes to signing on for it was thinking about poetic form. The Odyssey and the Iliad, as you may know, are composed all the way through in dactylic hexameter. So a dactyl, dactylos, is the Greek for finger. And so a dactylic means the same structure as a finger. Human finger has long, short, short, la, la, la. And hexameter, like hexagon, it means 6. So a hexameter is 6 units of sound, units of rhythm. So the Odyssey and the Iliad have that rhythm of dactylic hexameter all the way through. Andramoi, ennepe, musa, polutropon, hosmala, polla. It has that really regular, repetitive beat all the way through. And of course, it's part of the legacy of a long oral tradition. Greece didn't have reading or writing for several centuries, during which time people were singing, in a way, rapping these poetic stories. In order to have that tradition work, it has to have a regular rhythm. And I was aware that most contemporary translations are in free verse. They don't have any kind of rhythm. And it seemed to me that there was a place, even if I wasn't going to do anything else, for a translation that was going to be much more regular metrically than the other translations that were mostly being used. So I decided to use iambic pentameter, the rhythm of Shakespeare, or the rhythm of Milton, to create an equivalent for what did dactylic hexameter mean in archaic Greece. The equivalent, I think, in Anglophone poetics is iambic pentameter. So I also chose to do the same number of lines as the original to keep the pace. Most translations are much longer than the original, because of course the translator always has that dilemma of this word in my language doesn't totally correspond to any word in the original, and vice versa. Languages don't actually totally map onto each other. There's never a one-to-one correspondence between this word means exactly the same, has exactly the same connotations as that word. So a translator is always going to have that temptation to expand. I know it means 100 different things. I could use 100 different words. So let me put down 3 just to cover my bases. And you end up with a translation that's half as long again as the original. I didn't want to do that, so I forced myself not to by saying ahead of time, I'm just going to use the same number of lines as the original. So this is just giving you a few examples of how different translators have chosen what to do about the meter. A lot of them are prose. The earliest one in English by Chapman is in rhyming couplets. Some of them are in long lines, but they aren't actually hexameter. Most of them are in free verse. So I chose not to do either free verse or rhyming couplets. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy. So I wanted in general to convey the pacing of the original. That's part of what I was emphasizing about the line-for-line thing, which didn't seem to me just an arid exercise. It seemed to me that I wanted to maintain the same number of lines because I wanted to convey the page-turner quality of Homer. Of course, Homer comes from an era when there were no pages, so page-turner is the wrong word. but the please keep going fascinating storyteller. In antiquity, people chose to listen to Homer as entertainment. It was thought of as exciting and fun, not something which you're going to force yourself to have to get through. So I think part of the question about pacing is, if you make it too long, it becomes too boring, and more boring than the original is. In general, I wanted to convey the musicality, clarity, vividness, emotional, psychological depth, multivocality, beauty, and narrative drive. It seemed to me essential elements of the original. I also wanted to write as well as I possibly could, on the principle that a great poem shouldn't, if possible, be turned into a terrible one. An issue for any translator is what to do about repetitions and formulae. The Homeric poems are, in the original, extremely repetitive because, as I've said, they're based on an oral tradition. If you're composing from scratch, you need tropes, you need phrases that you can just plug into a particular position in the line. You're stuck, or you don't ever want to get stuck and think, you know what I'm going to say next. You have to have some phrases that you can plug in there. You don't want to have to always pause to think of an original adjective to apply to every hero or every bit of furniture. And so instead you have these building blocks which make up the line, so that ships are always going to be dark or well-balanced or speedy or quick. They're never going to be slow ships. You're never going to have a creative idea about a new adjective for a ship. It's always going to be the same. It seems to me that in an oral culture, repetition is highly valued, and it suggests this is important. You have an important ship, so it's going to be a quick ship. Whereas in a literate culture like ours, if you keep on repeating, the text is going to start to feel dead, and it's going to start to feel like the author hasn't even bothered, and so I'm not even going to care about this. Repetition doesn't feel the same way now to the way it felt in archaic Greece. So then it seemed to me that in various experiments that I could have some elements of repetition. So I could repeat Humble Slave, or I could repeat Wine Dark Sea, but I couldn't have 100% as much repetition as the original without feeling I was totally losing the reader and creating an effect that was different from what the original's effect was. So in some cases, I varied the formulae. For instance, there are 20 times in the Odyssey where the goddess Dawn appears. The line is exactly the same every time. She's always early born. She's always a goddess. She always appears, and she's always either early born or newborn, depending how you translate it. She always has rosy fingers, or rhododactylos fingers. It's the same word as what I said about the meter, dactylos. So Dawn has the dactylos too. Dawn is in a way a sort of figure for how does the poem mark its own time. It marks time through meter and through dawn. So I kept the same components, but I mixed them up on the different iterations, which is of course a really fun thing to do. And I hope in a way it makes more visible, more alive feeling, the metaphors that are so vivid in the original. Questions about verse form are related to larger issues of style. I aimed for a readable, clear register, avoiding archaisms, foreignisms, and high rhetoric as much as possible, to bring out the original's clarity, simplicity, and speed. I know some readers have wanted to label my translation style as modernizing or domesticizing or colloquial, but I think that's only part of what I'm actually doing, even beyond the fact that most people don't speak Ambach Pentameter all the time. There's other ways that my language is artful or artificial. I avoided contractions like doesn't and don't. I wanted to create a register that wasn't going to make you have to look words up in the dictionary all the time, but that was also going to feel a little bit different from normal speech. It's going to be very close to normal speech, but not quite the same thing. Homeric Greek is actually a mix of dialects from different parts of the Greek-speaking world, from different eras, which again is a legacy of oral tradition. So it's different peoples as well as different people from different regions. Their different traditions come into the poem that we have. I could have tried to replicate that or echo that linguistic collage quality by using a mix of Cockney, Chaucerian English, Glaswegian English, California slang, Brooklyn slang, and just mix it all up, and it would have been a bit like Finnegan's Wake. It would have been great to do, but it wouldn't necessarily have been fun to read. And it also wouldn't have enabled me to convey anything else about Homer, such as that there are really interesting characters and a really exciting story. That would have actually got totally lost in the I'm showing off linguistically thing. So instead, just as a way of nodding to linguistic diversity, I thought it's a good thing if some of my word choices are a little bit weird and mocked. But I can't make them all weird and mocked, because otherwise I can't do anything else. But I can have a few weird word choices. And some of them might be, this is slightly more colloquial than I thought, or it might be just, this is a cool, weird word, like ossifrage. I love the word ossifrage. It was nice to get to use it. Translation theorists like Antoine Berman and Lawrence Venuti, echoing the theologian Schleiermacher, have argued that translators have an ethical obligation to write in a style they call foreignizing, what you might less charitably call translationese. They argue that foreignizing is the only way to pay due respect to alien cultures, rather than forcing them into the hegemonic Anglophone mode. Because, of course, English has this whole dominance over world culture, right? That people think it only really matters if it's translated into English. We don't try and translate into, we don't think that there should be more and more things translated into Urdu. And on one level, I think there really is a problematic blindness in North American and British cultures to questions about translation and to non-Anglophone literatures. Like most people in America don't read things that were originally written in different languages very much. Most books in the bookstore are not originally written in something else. I don't think the solution is to translate all non-English texts into an off-puttingly foreignizing style. That seems like the quickest way to ensure that nobody ever wants to read, or that people read even less translated literature than they already do. The theorists also argue that translators and their readers should make translation more visible as a process, rather than perpetuating the fiction that translations provide a transparent window through which the reader gets access to the original. I think that's a good principle, but I would add that the creation of visibility implies different practical strategies for the translator, the writer, depending on the cultural place of the translated text in the target culture. In the case of modern novels, I think there really is an expectation that it's going to be invisible that this is a translation, right? If you read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, you don't expect to be noticing, oh, this doesn't feel like English. That must show that this is a real translation. Instead, you think, I want just to get through the pages of this kind of boring page-turner book. I know to be done with it and say that I read it. Or maybe you like that book, I don't know. I think there's a very different set of expectations when it applies to ancient literature. And with ancient epic in particular, I think we expect ancient epic to sound ancient. So it should be archaic, probably unreadable, written in a weird, unidiomatic kind of language to convey the alienness of the oldie-timey text. There are lots of 20th century translations of Greco-Roman classics that are kind of like that. They have a discourse of authenticity that comes with, this isn't real English. So it must be, if it's not real English, then surely it's like Greek, even if Greek isn't actually very much like bad English. And on the other hand, we expect ancient epic to sound epic. And that means bombastic, wordy, sub-Miltonic or Whitman-esque, and this modern idea of unquestioned macho heroism. So my goal in producing a different kind of translation that isn't either of those things isn't to say those dominant modes are impossible interpretations, but just that they aren't the only possible ways of reading or translating Homer. So this is a famous painting of the hero Heracles deciding between pleasure and virtue. I think we quite often have an idea of the translator's task is to choose, like Heracles, between pleasure and virtue, right? You have to choose either it's going to be pretty and poetic, or it's going to be virtuous and truthful, but it can't be both. But also, that's a totally false binary, right? I mean, even beyond the fact that these women are both beautiful and they both look exactly the same, it's also the case that there isn't just one thing that the Odyssey means. There isn't just one thing that it means in English, let alone one thing it means in general, forever. So this is the artist Sidney Sherman. This is a few of her many, many, many self-portraits. And they're all, of course, all of her. But they're all truthful, but they're all good portraits. So my point is just that there can be multiple different truthful portraits, multiple different translations that can be telling something truthful about the original. The real question for a translator isn't, do I tell the truth or tell a pretty lie? It's a much more complex issue, which truths to tell, out of the many true facts about the original, not all of which you can convey all at once in a single version in a different language. One of the most important truths I wanted to tell about the Odyssey was that it's fun and easy to read. It's a gripping human story, told, as I've said, in a beautiful, regular musical meter, clear, simple syntax, designed to be readily comprehensible by illiterate audiences, performed out loud. Another essential truth was that it's a complex and polyvocal poem. It may seem like those things are in tension with each other, but I think that's only because we have an idea that folk poetry or ancient poetry, that should be simple-minded, which of course that doesn't follow at all. The ancients weren't any more simple-minded than we are. People who can't read aren't necessarily simple-minded. So I've seen from teaching the poem that there's this idea that it's a sort of old-school comic book superhero story about an unproblematically heroic male Western hero, implicitly white, who's good because he crushes the bad guys, monsters, foreigners, witchy women, understands the value of hospitality, which apparently was important for the ancient Greeks. You write it in the exam, you get the A. The story has a happy ending because the good guy gets back with the objectified wife, regains all the wealth, all the slaves, nice celebration of family values, consumerism, patriarchy, war, superiority of normal male white people over foreigners and girls. And I wanted to try to, I actually don't think the Odyssey is only doing that. And I don't even think it's quite doing that at all. It certainly isn't the only thing that the poem is about. Odysseus' perspective is certainly not the only perspective in the poem. So that reading, I think, is an extreme simplification of what the whole poem is doing. I wanted to show the complexity of this genuinely much more complex kind of text. The Odyssey explores two central Greek concepts. The first is nostos, a word that means homecoming. You might think it's a pretty straightforward thing. It just means getting back to the place where you live. But the Odyssey, of course, is exploring a case where homecoming is as hard as it could possibly be. And in doing so, it shows there are profound questions raised by the concepts of coming home and of being at home. Is homecoming essentially exclusive? I was hinting already about what does Odysseus do when he gets home. He reintroduces himself gradually to some members of the household, and he also kills a lot of people. The homecoming is inherently dependent on who am I going to get out, even if I have to kill them to make sure they're not in my house anymore, including both some slaves as well as some elite male warriors. The second central concept in the Odyssey is xenia, which means the idealized relationship between strangers, guests, and hosts. In this code, people have a deep obligation to take care of strangers in need, and in giving and receiving hospitality, families form lasting friendships across great distances of space and time. It's in many ways an inspiring ideal, especially in times of xenophobia and hostility to immigrants. Obviously, the word xenophobia comes from the Greek xenia, and I think it's striking that we have the word xenophobia, we don't like them, and we don't necessarily talk about xenophilia. We love them, let them come. But the poem is also showing us how exclusive this code is. It only applies to elite women, not women, to elite men, not women who aren't supposed to travel. Think about Helen of Troy. She's the elite woman who leaves her house and goes somewhere else and doesn't have good consequences. And it also shows us how easily xenia can go wrong, as when the suitors act like bad guests barging into Odysseus' home without asking, and when Odysseus is exactly the same kind of bad guest barging into the Cyclops' home without asking. In both cases, violence ensues. The host responds by attacking the guests, or eating them, as the case may be. The original poem is compelling because of the nuance and complicatedness of its presentation of its own core ideals and values, and also because of how deeply it lets us inside the perspectives of so many different characters. It's not, I think it's often presented, and maybe I feel like the Mel Gibson version is going to be this version of one man's epic story. And I think the Odyssey itself is not one man's epic story. The Odyssey is multiple people's story, and those stories are intertwined with one another. So I'm just going to read the beginning in my translation. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed, and for their own mistakes, they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. So, of course, I wanted that focus on complicated in the first line to tell people about what the poem is like, as well as what the central character is like. I think you can see, even in those first few lines, that this is a story which is about Odysseus' successful nostos, his journey home. It's also about all those other people who don't get home. How many people does he leave with to go to Troy? Out of all those ships full of people, only one gets back. And the narrator is interested in those who die as well as those who survive. I think the diversity of perspectives and the emotional depth, the complexity, sometimes gets erased in translation. A concrete example of this is that I've been surprised to realize how much more I use the word slave than other translators do, even very contemporary translators. Those words are very often rendered as servants or maids or housekeepers or nurse in a way that makes it very unclear that Odysseus is an enslaver, a slave owner. And I think that's to do with an idea that Odysseus has to be the quote-unquote hero in a modern sense. We have to admire him. We can't admire him if he's a slave owner. So let's pretend he just has problems with his servants, and then it's going to feel more okay. I don't think we actually should. I don't think the poem becomes less interesting. I think it becomes more interesting once we recognize all these tensions and complexities in the ways that it depicts social relationships and imbalances of power and agency, not only between mortals and immortals, which is, of course, the huge imbalance of power, but also between elite mortals and enslaved mortals, and also between male mortals, female mortals, and so on. I was interested in bringing out how the Odyssey allows us to feel for Odysseus himself in all his vast complexity, but also to feel for and understand all the other characters whom he visits, befriends, abandons, mutilates, enslaves, marries, shacks up with, kills, or lets die, many of whom don't have a journey home, or their version of home or community is radically impacted by him. So I said that during the 5 years it took me to work on my version, I didn't look at other translations, but then my version came out at the end of 2017. And since then, I've done some close looking at multiple different little passages. And it seems to me that there really is a world of difference in interpretation and characterization, as well as style, in details of difference. I've noticed how, for instance, translators seem to shape the narrative, so we look only from one point of view, usually that of Odysseus. For instance, in the renderings of Book 5, in which Odysseus has been for 7 years with the goddess Calypso, and then he's got bored of it, and he's sitting on the beach crying every day, and eventually builds a raft and leaves. In many translations, I think Calypso is presented like a hysterical nymphomaniac for complaining about what's happening. And I think that's to do with how translators can have a false friend, that because there's the word nymph in Greek and the word nymph in English, you think, oh, that's the same, I can just translate her as a nymph, even if nympho in English has totally different connotations from powerful goddess nymph in archaic Greek. Similarly, many modern translators made Polyphemus the Cyclops into, quote, monster or savage, which I think is in keeping with modern colonial prejudice against native peoples, and somewhat obscures the clarity of the Greek about the fact that Polyphemus is definitely a human being. He's an anthropos, from which we get anthropology. And the text is allowing this complicated degree of sympathy with the person whose home is invaded, as well as awareness of how terrifying it is to be eaten. So I'm going to just talk in a little bit more detail about one passage, which I think is an example of how I worked to bring out the complexity of the Odyssey's narrative, its picture of a society, and the diversity of its perspectives. So this is the moment, and I'm sorry for spoilers, Odysseus, as I've already spoiled, does get home to Ithaca. He's in disguise. He reveals himself gradually to the members of his household, not including his wife. So he just reveals himself to the trusted members of his household. And with the help of his dopey son Telemachus and 2 slaves, they manage to slaughter all the frat boys who've been invading the house and harassing Penelope for the last few years. And then once the elite killings are done, Odysseus delegates the final set of killings to his son Telemachus. So this is a big moment, because Telemachus has been trying to grow up to manhood this whole time. Now is his big chance to get to do some solo massacring, which of course is the ideal for the Homeric warrior, is to get to do solo massacring. But he only gets the kind of victim which the Homeric warrior doesn't necessarily want, because it's not killing an equal, it's killing the enslaved people, the ones who've been claimed by the suitors. So Odysseus says, get all the women who've been, as Odysseus says earlier in the same book, raped by the suitors, get them together and hack the life out of them with long swords. Telemachus, surprisingly, because he hasn't taken initiative up to this point, does take initiative and decides that that's the wrong murder weapon, and instead he's going to kill them by hanging instead. So I think it's a really disturbing passage in the original, not least because I think the poem presents as being a very sharp difference between the elite man killing, which is the Odysseus and the suitors part, and then Telemachus hanging enslaved people. It's a very different kind of killing. And it's also very different in that the poem creates real ambiguity about the degree of agency that the enslaved people have if they've also been raped and claimed by owners. The poem isn't presenting them necessarily as they've made bad choices. I think it's presenting it that these women have been claimed by the wrong owners, so just as if you move house, you don't want the old owner's furniture there, you also don't want the old owner's human property still there. So I think it's about the cleanup. But it seems to me that in many translations, you get a very different interpretation. You get an idea that this is an act of justice. Gendered violence is something we like and approve of. And that comes about through how different translators render what the murderer is like right before he kills them. Telemachus is always pepanomenos in the Greek, which suggests something maybe kind of neutral about he's always taken some kind of thought. Was it a good thought? Might not have been. Maybe he's just being moody teenager, which is what he usually seems to be. But a lot of translators seem to suggest that he had a really good idea, and then this is what he went on to do. So this is actually one of the most surprising things I found in looking at other translations, the degree to which a lot of translators, not just one, add in abusive language, so that Telemachus is made to use abusive, misogynistic language against the women that he's about to kill, when the Greek Telemachus doesn't do that. The Greek Telemachus suggests there's something shameful about the continued existence of these women. I want to eliminate shame, so I'm going to eliminate the women, which doesn't suggest they are bad people or that they are sexual criminals. Whereas the English translators, a lot of them, do make them into sexual criminals or dehumanize them. These creatures, beasts, trolls, sluts, you sluts, whores, sluts. It doesn't seem to me that we actually need that language. And I think it's kind of interesting that the translators feel the need to impose a particular kind of misogyny into the mouth of Telemachus when the archaic Greek Telemachus doesn't articulate it in those terms. So then we have a wonderful Homeric simile buried in this passage, in which the women, as they are hung up with the noose around their necks, are compared to birds, doves or thrushes. This is beautifully vivid imagery, which also, I think, conveys just a glimpse of the women's perspective. What do the birds want? What do the women want? The birds want to go home. The simile tells us they want to go home, they want to go to their nests. They want the same thing that Odysseus wants. They want a nostos, a homecoming. They don't get that. And so I think it fits with the pattern that we've already seen in the proem of the homecoming of Odysseus entails the not homecoming and death of many, many other people. But I think a lot of the ways different translators treat it, it doesn't convey that in the same way. Instead, it conveys it's okay to kill women because it's like killing chicken. And then the final detail is that this horrible detail of the women's feet moving just a little bit, which I think in the Fagel's translation, when they kicked up heels for a while, I think there's an implication that this is what happens to party girls. So, of course, this is a narrative that makes sense in terms of misogynistic gendered violence, which, again, is not, I think, what the Greek is doing. The Greek is suggesting there's a terrible final movement, and then the narrator is filled with pity about this. And that I think the narrator is trying to enable us to feel pity, which I think it just detracts from the pity if we think they're dancing, they kind of like it, they wanted it. So I'm just going to read my version of that terrible passage. Telemachus then took initiative, insisting, I refuse to grant these girls a clean death, since they poured down shame on me and mother when they lay beside the suitors. At that he wound a piece of sailor's rope round the rotunda and round the mighty pillar, stretched up so high no foot could touch the ground. As doves or thrushes spread their wings to fly home to their nests, but someone set a trap. They crash into a net, a bitter bedtime. Just so the girls, their heads all in a row, were strung up with a noose around their necks to make their death an agony. They gasped, feet twitching for a while, but not for long. So I feel like I should have done a trigger warning before talking about that scene. I know it's a very disturbing scene, so I thought I should end by reading a happier one, which is the scene that many people in antiquity thought should be the real ending of the poem. So again, I'm totally spoiling it. I'm not going right to the end, but I'm going to what many people thought was the proper end, which is when the heteronormative marriage gets reaffirmed, Odysseus and Penelope finally get back together. I feel there's a tendency, again, in both the scholarship on the scene and in translations of the scene, to reduce the complexity of perspectives, to suggest the main thing is that they're both super happy and that's happily ever after in a Disney princess kind of way. They're both smart. It's all great. They have so much in common. And I actually think what the Greek text does is show that even at this moment of connection, there's this huge imbalance of power, that Penelope has nothing like the same kind of power that he has. And also this huge imbalance in how do they see the marriage? How do they define the central article of furniture, which represents the marriage, the bed? He sees it as something that I, first person singular, made. And let me tell you about me. Whereas she sees it as this lost opportunity for togetherness. Their pronouns are totally different. He says I, she says we, or in Greek there's also a dual for two people, which Odysseus is not that interested in. But then we have another wonderful simile, which suggests that these different perspectives can also flip into each other. And I'm going to, again, do my silly voices. I do kind of a queen voice for Penelope because I want to emphasize that she's very elite, not an enslaved woman. This is Penelope speaking to test her husband. So she does a clever test to figure out whether he really is her husband, and also to, in a way, to underline to him that this whole premise of she had to stay faithful for 20 years while he was gallivanting around the Mediterranean, she could have slept with a suitor. Maybe she did. And so she tests him by saying, you can go to bed right here outside the room. The bed is supposed to be immovable. The wife is supposed to be absolutely, essentially faithful forever. And Penelope's sort of testing by saying, do you know what kind of marriage we have? Do you know absolutely for sure that I was faithful or that the bed didn't move? Also, even if it did move, or if it didn't move, who moved it and what was going on in those 20 years that you weren't with me? So it's a way that it's the only possible tool she has of pushing his buttons and of suggesting she might have some kind of power, even though it's an entirely limited kind of power compared to his. So this is Penelope speaking, and she first speaks to the enslaved woman who's going to have to do the chore of making the bed, because, of course, the slaves do all the work. Now, Eurycleia, make the bed for him outside the room he built himself. Pull out the bedstead and spread quilts and blankets on it. She spoke to test him, and Odysseus was furious and told his loyal wife, "Woman, your words have cut my heart. Who moved my bed? It would be difficult for even a master craftsman, though a god could do it with ease. No man, however young and strong, could pry it out. There is a trick to how this bed was made. I made it, no one else. Inside the court there grew an olive tree with delicate long leaves, full grown and green, as sturdy as a pillar, and I built the room around it. I packed stones together and fixed a roof and fitted doors. At last I trimmed the olive tree and used my bronze to cut the branches off from root to tip and skillfully transformed it to a bedpost. Now I have told the secret trick, the token. But woman, wife, I do not know if someone, a man, has cut the olive trunk and moved my bed, or if it is still safe." At that, her heart and body suddenly relaxed. She recognized the tokens he had shown her. She burst out crying and ran straight towards him and threw her arms around him, kissed his face and said, "Now you have told the story of our bed. You made my stubborn heart believe in you." This made him want to cry. He held his love, his faithful wife, and wept. As welcome as the land to swimmers when Poseidon wrecks their ship at sea and breaks it with great waves and driving winds. A few escape the sea and reach the shore, their skin all caked with brine. Grateful to be alive, they crawl to land, So glad she was to see her own dear husband, and her white arms would not let go his neck. So obviously there's lots to say about that passage, and pretty much every passage in the Odyssey has so much to say and discuss, and I hope you'll have a really fun time talking about it. And before opening up for questions from you, I wanted to make a final point about translation in general, which is that I think ideally translators have to be chameleons. In translating the Odyssey, I wanted to convey something already of there are multiple different voices going on, even in this just this one poem. That's part of what it is to be an epic. It's this voice not just of one person, but of multiple people. It shows multiple perspectives. But then I also am aware that different texts represent different voices differently. Now I'm moving on to working on the Iliad, and I think I have to be responsive to the very different mood of that poem, even though the language is very similar to that of the Odyssey. I didn't want my Seneca translations to sound the same as my Euripides, or my Sophocles to sound the same as my Homer. I think there's a limit to how much sense it makes to talk about translation in the abstract. The work is always done word by word, text by text. The Iliad is a much more intensely claustrophobic poem than the Odyssey. So just as a taster, here's my current draft at the beginning. I was going to read my beginning of the Odyssey, which in a way it has similar overlapping themes in certain respects. Both poems are about a male elite warrior who's separated from his community. How does he get back reintegrated? They're both about the terrible deaths caused by male aggression, male anger, desire for status, and the mysterious wishes of the gods. So I'm just going to read the beginning, and then I'm hoping you guys are going to have questions. Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of Peleus' son Achilles, cause of so much suffering for the Greeks, that sent many strong souls to Hades, making men a feast for birds and prey for dogs. The plan of Zeus was moving to its end, beginning when those two argued first, Lord Agamemnon and glorious Achilles.
Thank you. That's so tantalizing. Wish you could keep going. I want to hear more. So it's a Humanities Forum. It's a custom to have questions, and it's a custom, of course, to privilege student questions. So if students have questions, we'll go to professor questions. We absolutely have to, but we really don't want to. We would love to hear some student questions, and I will pass around the mic. Questions?
Well, I was just wondering if you thought that Odysseus remained faithful, even though he, with all of his gallivanting around the Mediterranean, when he finally meets Penelope again.
No, certainly not. No, why would you think that? No. I mean, I think that the modern, post-Christian notions about what is adultery, what is fidelity, I don't think those are present really in the world of this poem. I think what's present in the world of this poem is an idea that the elite household, the oikos, is very important. We don't want a household to break down. We don't want a household to be invaded by people who barge in without asking. We also don't want the household to break down by the elite wife goes off and has kids with someone else. That's going to destroy this household. This household is defined by the man brings wealth and enslaved people into this household by going out and stealing it and killing people and maybe sleeping with other people along the way, comes back and enriches the household. That's what it is to serve the household as a man. As a woman, sexual fidelity is essential to the household. So I think it's an entirely unparalleled position for the woman versus the man in that model of the heteronormative marriage. Yeah.
More questions? Raise your hand. Oh, right here.
This is a lot scarier than I expected. So you begin your translation with "Let me begin with a complicated man," and Homer kind of does that in the third and fourth line. But how do you think that the beginning of your translation affects the time in which you wrote it? So you wrote it in 2017. So is there a lot of political dialogue inserted in that?
So just about the word numbers. So the first word of the original is the equivalent of man, which also means husband in Greek, because they're the same word. Andra is the first word. I'm going to bring up the original. If anyone knows even the Greek alphabet, you can see that's the first line. Andra moi. I thought the word man has to have a prominent position in my first line. And I spent many weeks trying to make man the first word. And I couldn't do it without making it sound like, man, exciting story coming up, it's amazing, which is the wrong resonance. So I put it as the last word in the first line, because I think the last word in a line is also a prominent position. It's sort of hard to, I think it's hard for anyone to say, ... how do I go from what I read in the news this morning to what I did in my work, what I thought about as I was reading this complex text from a completely different era. I don't think anyone exists out of time or out of their own society. I also was aware that probably the coverage of my translation and the headlines that had to do with first woman translator, I think I had a lot to, the coverage as opposed to my work had a lot to do with the presidential election, and we can't do the headline of first woman president. Instead, we can do first woman translator. It's a sort of, it's a compensation prize or something. I think for some people that was what was part of the reception. But in terms of what was I thinking about, I certainly wasn't thinking I need to make archaic Greece or mythic Greece sound exactly the same as contemporary America. Of course I didn't, because they're different. But I was also aware that, and I'm still aware, that the questions I'm asking of antiquity, the questions I ask when I engage with ancient literature, of course those questions are informed both by my scholarly reading life, they're informed by all the other literature I've read, all the scholarship I've read, but also by the times I'm living in. Yeah. I'm not sure that's a kind of meandering answer, but might be the best I can do.
Hand to the back. Getting here will be a challenge. Let me see here.
Did the vocabulary of the rest of the Homeric cycle affect your translation of the Iliad?
So I haven't finished my translation of the Iliad yet.
I mean of the
Odyssey. I haven't done translations of any of the Homeric hymns or of Hesiod. Each of those, the Homeric hymns are somewhat later than the Homeric poems. I'm writing English, not Greek, right? So my reading of the original is one thing. My decisions about how to convey my total understanding of the original, as total as I can get it, in English is another thing. And there's no equivalent exactly to the Homeric poems in the English literary tradition. I guess I thought about, and I think now as I'm sort of struggling with, so how is Apollo appearing in the Iliad, at the beginning of the Iliad? Comes down like night. Can the depictions of Apollo that are more fleshed out in the Homeric hymns to Apollo help me think about that character in archaic Greek context? Maybe they can, but I think not on a sort of fully line-by-line level, but I think they can help me understand exactly how is this character conceptualized. Yeah.
I know you said that it took 5 years to translate the Odyssey. In terms of hours spent doing it, if you were to give an approximate estimate, what would it be, and how far are you into translating the Iliad?
I didn't keep timesheets, so maybe I should. I should have clocked in and clocked out. That would have been actually kind of cool. I could have shown off by saying how. I don't know. I have 3 kids, and so a lot of my work was done while they were at school or aftercare, or while I wasn't playing card games or whatever I had to do to make them dinner. So I guess it wasn't 24 hours a day, and also I sleep at night and all that. But most of my working life for those 5 years, beyond being in the classroom or being with my kids, most of my working life was this. I am about four books into the Iliad out of 24, so quite a lot still to go. I've done some other little bits, but yeah. About a sixth of the way through.
First, thank you very much for the lecture. I truly enjoyed that. So I presume your first language is English.
Yes.
If your first language is not English, do you think you can still do that? Translate Odyssey from English from Greek to English.
I think it's very difficult. I mean, I think that there's often an idea that the primary thing a translator needs is deep knowledge of the original language. I think one thing a translator really needs deep knowledge of both languages, including deep knowledge of the literary traditions of the language you're translating into. I mean, I felt that not just I speak English, and I've been speaking English for quite a long time. I've also read a lot of English, including a lot of poetic English. I felt that that very much informed the poetic choices I was making. I felt that, I mean, a lot of translations are written by people who are very interested in the source language and aren't necessarily interested in the literature of the language they're translating into. I mean, I also think it's possible, and I think it's possible also for translators to work in teams too. I mean, there are many good examples of sort of pairs of translators where one of them is better on one language and one is better on the other, but they both have some of each. And I think that can work really well. So I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's very difficult if you don't have, in a way, translating is writing, right? On the most fundamental level, translating is writing. Writing an epic poem in your non-native language, that's actually a very big ask. I mean, it's difficult anyway to write an epic poem, but especially if you're not native in the language. But
thank you. And I was just curious about how, what possessed you to decide to translate this? Like, was it before or after before you started the translating that you noticed that English translations were missing a lot of the elements from the original text? Did you discover this before, or was it kind of during your time translating?
it was a bit of both. I mean, I guess I was trying to sketch how it was a bit of both, because, I mean, in order to think it's worthwhile to sign the contract and spend 5 years of my life doing that, I thought I should do a little bit of investigation and figure out if there's already a translation out there that I adore and that I would recommend over anything else, then I wouldn't have done it, right? It would have been a complete waste of time. So I did as I say, I did a sort of dip into other translations before signing the contract to try and figure out, do I feel that in general there might be things missing? I mean, for instance, about the dominance of free verse or prose as opposed to metrical verse. And I thought, at least I can do that, even if nothing else. And then it's only later that I sort of looked more carefully at other bits that I hadn't looked at in multiple translations. I mean, like the thing about the sluts. I didn't know that when I was doing my translation. I didn't know that I was doing something special in not putting the word sluts in there. You know, it didn't occur to me to do so. But I didn't know ahead of time that that was something that people do.
Swift-footed Hermes.
I find the fact that you said there are multiple stories in the Odyssey to be very, very interesting interpretation. And and there's a diversity of stories. I'm just wondering, could you tell me so far in the 4 books that you've read, that you're translating the Iliad, do you see the same diversity of stories or not?
I think it's a very different poem, and obviously its storytelling mode is very different. I mean, the way that the Odyssey, it's supposedly, you think from the title that you start off with Odysseus, and instead you get 4 books of Telemachus. The way that it sort of, it does this storytelling mode that's about circles and lies, which of course is the way its protagonist is always operating. It's always about circles and lies. Before you get to the main point, you're going to get another tall story. You're going to get the story of Nestor, the story of Menelaus, and so on. I don't think the Iliad is like that in the same way. It's, of course, in a way it echoes, you know, its equivalent protagonist is Achilles, and he hates, like Hades Gates, the man who says one thing and hides another in his heart. It's quick, 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 all the way to death, all the way to truth. But I also think, even from that initial quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon, we're shown this absolute diversity of the ways that even within this tiny space of geography, it's all just taking place in this very, very short space between here's the sea, here's the walls. There's hardly any time, there's hardly any space. These people are almost identical with each other. They're both elite warriors, and yet they're completely different. So I think it's actually doing this, the same thing, but in this sort of very, very compressed, intense way, where Achilles and Agamemnon actually have totally different visions of what it is to be an elite warrior, visions of how do you acquire masculine status, how do you let out your aggression, how do you articulate that, how do you display your rage. And even though on some level they're the same, they're also totally different. So I think it's both the same and different. Yeah.
The passages where Homer speaks to Eumaeus as you, what is the significance of that?
That's a good question. So for people who haven't read the Odyssey or read it recently, the narrator speaks directly to the enslaved swineherd Eumaeus and says, "You, Eumaeus, then you did blah, blah, blah." That's the only character to whom the narrator speaks directly in the second person in the Odyssey. In the Iliad, the narrator speaks directly in a similar way to Menelaus and Patroclus. And again, those are the only characters in the Iliad who get the second person address. And you can say, as some scholars, one possible answer is, it's a product of the oral tradition, it's a formula, it doesn't mean anything, which I think is kind of a lame answer, but it's a possible answer. I think it's, even insofar as the formally can be meaningful as well. Why that character, why not another character? I think it's to do with the very interesting way the Odyssey positions itself about class. That on some level, it's this very elite warrior-focused, elite household-focused kind of poem, and yet we're also being led to be particularly interested in the perspectives of the enslaved characters, especially the perspectives of the quote-unquote good slaves, the loyal slaves, the slaves whose continued existence within the household is just as essential to the running of the household as the faithful wife. So I think this is sort of positioning of how are we going to look at all this action, all this homecoming of one elite man. We're not going to look at it from Odysseus' perspective, because the narrator never says, and then you, Odysseus, did something. We're going to look at it from in a way, this sort of sidelong, almost minor character, but a character whose story also parallels that of the big guy Odysseus. He's also somebody who's been taken from his home and who will never get back to his home because he's a slave. So I think it's part of the way the poem is not just looking at everything through Odysseus' eyes.
What would you say is one of the biggest challenges you faced in translating the Odyssey?
There were so many challenges. I mean, I guess I've already said about some of them just in terms of, but I hinted at some of them just in terms of word order, right? That of course every language is different. Every language, the connotations of this word don't mean the same as that word. We have this one up there, so maybe we'll talk about this one. Andra is the first word. I couldn't make it the first word in my English. That's a huge challenge. The challenge of, and I talked also a little bit about repetitive formulae, right? That was a huge challenge, just wrestling with how many repetitions do I think the reader can bear? How much do I have to echo the repetitiveness of the original in order to make it feel the same way? Or in some way, what does even the same way mean? What is equivalence? What is the equivalent of the experience of being somebody in the 7th century BC versus being now? How do I create the same experience for you that a woman 3,000 years ago was having when she heard Homer? I don't know. I mean, I always found, this is maybe related to the question of how many hours, and every day I wouldn't know exactly how many lines will I get through in a certain number of hours, because there would be things I didn't know I was going to get stuck on that I would get stuck on. Right? I mean, I could read a passage that was perfectly easy in the Greek. I know what it says. I don't even have to, I mean, I can look all the words up to try and figure out where else they're used in Homer. I usually did do that, even if I already sort of knew. I would do that, read it again. It's perfectly easy, and yet I still have no idea how am I going to do that so it's not going to sound awkward and stiff in English, and it doesn't in the Greek. I would just be constantly getting stuck on things I didn't know I was going to get stuck on.
Thank you. Whenever we undertake a massive scholarly project or a translation, I always find it's a voyage of discovery, and you're never quite at the same place. This is your theme of home, right? You never quite come to the same home again. Yeah. Is your experience of Homer's Odyssey, after having completed this massive undertaking, do you see the text in a profoundly different way? How similar is this text to the text that you knew, and in what meaningful way is it different?
That's a great question, yes. I mean, I guess like Odysseus' Ithaca, it's both the same place and a different place. It's both, I mean, as I was emphasizing, thought I knew at the start that there's something about narrative complexity that I was already aware was there in the poem. I was already aware of narratological readings of Homer, which had already taught me that in a way. But I don't think I was fully aware of how complicated I think the social environment of the Odyssey is, how complex the depiction of cultural otherness is, and I think I also, like I think actually a lot of Homeric scholars, hadn't paid enough attention to the enslaved characters. And I was happy to get the Eumaeus question. I think I'd very often, if I'd had to retell the story of the Odyssey 5 or 7 years ago, I might have told the story only mentioning non-enslaved characters. I don't think I would do that now. It seems to me that all the enslaved characters have this absolutely crucial role in the narrative, as well as a crucial role in the definition of what a home is, what a household is, which members of the community get to choose to be there or don't get to choose to be there. And I think I hadn't realized just how deeply the poem is meditating on those things. And I think also just the degree to which all these echoing goddess characters are both the same and different is extra fascinating to me in a way that I hadn't quite realized. I mean, I thought, yeah, Calypso, Circe, Helen, Athena, they're all kind of the same, but they're also all subtly different. And there's the various ways that these ultra-powerful female characters are depicted as both, they all have this enormous power and this enormous power of deception and of weaving and of songcraft and of poetry, but they're all using those tropes in different ways.
Thank you so much for your talk. Vast majority of the students in this room right now are at the beginning of either their first year or their second year of the Western Civ curriculum. And I know that the vast majority of them are profoundly committed to it from intrinsic interest. But it's a large enough crowd that I bet there's one or two who are skeptical or feel as if it's kind of forced on them, old stuff forced on them by old people. Do you have any general advice to the students how to kind of regard the curriculum for the next year or two in a way that makes them help make it their own?
That's such a good and such a difficult question, because I mean, I can't necessarily talk about any particular text on the canon. I have no idea what you actually read apart from the Odyssey. I mean, I think just remembering that these are books written by people, and that actually these people, even though now they seem like they're old because they're dead, they weren't actually dead when they were creating these texts. You know? They're not actually about being dead or being old. They're usually about other things, which are, in most cases, experiences that either you have had or that you probably will have at some point in your life. I mean, that whole question of what do the humanities teach us? They teach us something about the vast differences and also vast commonalities in being human, right? That there are these human experiences that on some level you already have. You already know something about having a home, having parents, moving to a different place. And of course, every college student already has a version of those themes in the Odyssey about moving to a different place, meeting new people. Am I the same person now that I was back in my hometown, back in my place with my parents? What does it mean to grow up? What does it mean to be a man or to be a woman? I think those are sets of questions that you already sort of have. But then there are also themes in the Odyssey that you might not yet pick up on, or themes in the other books that maybe 10 years from now you're going to look back and realize, now it all makes sense, and now I realize something else that was in that text that I thought wasn't meaningful is meaningful. I mean, I find that when I reread the Odyssey, having children, it means something different from what it did when I only had parents. You know, I think that there are a lot of these texts that are sort of classified as Western canon or just great books of the world that are great books partly because they can speak to both so many different people, different cultures, different moments in your life. And that if you can just read them with an open mind, they're going to resonate in some way or other with you now, and they might resonate differently when you remember them later.
That seems like a great question to finish on. Please join me in thanking Dr. Wilson.